Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. For today's video, I feel like we need a bit of a serotonin boost after the unbelievable sadness of last week's video. Yeah. So today, let's dive deep and try to uncover fact from fiction about another very famous cowgirl of the Wild West. Was it all true, or did she make it all up? I'm talking about Calamity Jane. Let's get started. Martha Jane Cannary was born on May 1st, 1852 in Princeton, Missouri to parents Robert Wilson Cannary, who had a gambling problem, and her mother was Charlotte M. Cannary. Jane, as she mainly went by, was the eldest of 6 children with 2 brothers and 3 sisters. From this point on, I'm going to call her Jane because that's mainly what she went by. Before I continue, important info. For literally 100+ years, historians have struggled to 100% verify the many claims about Jane's life, mostly because available sources aren't reliable, including from Jane herself. But I've done the research, so I'll piece it together in the most accurate narrative timeline as I possibly could. If I missed some things, I'm sorry. If I got some things wrong, I'm sorry. This is Calamity Jane I'm talking about here. Just roll with it. Though we don't know much about her childhood, we do know that Jane loved the outdoors, rode horses from a young age, and her family moved a lot. In 1865, the family packed everything up and headed west to Virginia City, Montana to seek fortune in the gold fields. If there's one thing you should know about traveling in 1800s America is that you walked everywhere. Today, the route takes about 20 hours-ish by car, but back then, the trip took about 5 months. The family traveled as part of a wagon train, a group of people in a line of those iconic covered wagons. During the trip, since there were no podcasts to keep her entertained, Jane spent most of her time with the men in the group, learning to hunt, shoot, and ride horses. By the time they reached Montana in 1866, Jane had reportedly gained a reputation as an expert markswoman and a strong leader. In her own words, quote, "While on the way, the greater portion of my time was spent hunting along with the men and hunters of the party. In fact, I was at all times with the men when there was excitement and adventures to be had. By the time we reached Virginia City, I was considered a remarkable good shot and a fearless rider for a girl of my age." Unfortunately, when they reached Blackfoot, Montana, Jane's mother died of pneumonia. For reasons unknown, they moved again, this time to Salt Lake City, Utah, arriving in the summer of that same year. Shortly after their arrival, tragedy struck again when Jane's father died later that year in 1866, maybe 1867. So in give or take a year, Jane has moved a total of 1,500 miles. Both of her parents have died, suddenly making her head of the family, and she's, give or take, 12 years old. And I'm going to be saying give or take a lot because in Jane's story, there is a lot of give or take. Again, I don't know why. After their father died, Jane packed up the family again and they moved again, this time landing at Fort Bridger, Wyoming in May of 1868. At this time, Wyoming had just become an unincorporated territory because of some weird glitch and complications in the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. It's a whole thing. There's a lot of drama. Just know from Wyoming into South Dakota, it is lawless country. Anyway, from Fort Bridger, they traveled on the Union Pacific Railroad to Piedmont, Wyoming. There, Jane took whatever job she could find to provide for her family. She worked as everything from a cook to a dishwasher, a waitress, nurse, ox team driver to a dance hall girl or saloon girl. Basically, she worked in a saloon. In some other accounts, she claimed to have worked as a prostitute. Again, give or take. Now, from this point on, the true story of Martha Jane Cannary and Calamity Jane, the persona, begin to mush together and Just a whole bunch of this, you know? In 1870, Jane went to Fort Russell wearing a soldier's uniform and became a scout in, get this, General George Armstrong Custer's army when he headed south to Arizona that same year. She and the army returned to Wyoming in 1872. At that point on, Jane really leaned into dressing like a man. Mind you, face and feature-wise, she doesn't have the same feminine look as, say, an Annie Oakley. But Jane took it a step further. She not only looked and dressed like a man, she began to act like one. She shot like a cowboy, drank like a fish, and men, don't deny, some of you absolutely do this, exaggerated and a half tall tales of her life to any and all who would listen. And I don't want no man to say, I don't exaggerate things. Stop. This plays into why it's so hard to pin down many of her claims. Jane claimed, give or take, that when Custer's army went to Arizona with the eagerness to put the Indians on the reservations because we are manifesting destiny, that she became the most reckless, most daringest rider and the bestest, mostest, shotest, and the westest. In her own words, quote, during that time, I had a great many adventures with the Indians, for as a scout, I had a great many dangerous missions to perform, and while I was in many close places, always succeeded in getting away safely, for by this time, I was considered the most reckless and daring rider and one of the best shots in the Western country. Yeah, there's two problems with that. First, there's no record of her serving in Custer's army. Now, I had to Google this. And while there's no conclusive evidence that Custer did or did not allow women in his army, my initial theory was that she could pass as a man. I mean, her features could. Wrote down a man's name, didn't tell nobody, and bada bing, bada boom, Jane served in Custer's army. In my mind, she basically Mulan'd it. However, I found out that Jane was illiterate, so that theory went out the window. Second, and most damning, most contradictory, there is zero evidence of Custer ever going to Arizona. In reality, she might have served as a scout in then Lieutenant Colonel George R. Crook's army, starting in 1872, who at that time was in Arizona. In my mind, the fact that Custer didn't even go to Arizona, that squashes that claim right out the window. That sweeps that claim right out the window. You know what I mean. How Jane got the nickname Calamity Jane is, give or take, a heck of a story. Going back to the tale about her time with Custer's army. In 1872, when they returned to Wyoming, Jane was ordered to join a military campaign against Native Americans. This campaign involved Generals Custer, Crook, and Nelson Miles and lasted until the fall of 1873. It was during this time that Jane earned her famous nickname. According to Jane herself, they were stationed in Gooseneck Creek near Sheridan, Wyoming, where a guy named Captain Egan was in command of the post. I'm assuming the generals were gone at this point. The troops were ordered to stop an Indian uprising, and a couple of days later, while heading back to the camp, they were ambushed by a large group of Indians. And I'll let Jane take it from here. Quote, when on returning to the post, we were ambushed about 1.5 miles from our destination. When fired upon, Captain Egan was shot. I was riding in advance and on hearing the firing, turned in my saddle and saw the captain reeling in his saddle as though about to fall. I turned my horse and galloped back with all haste to his side and got there in time to catch him as he was falling. I lifted him onto my horse in front of me and succeeded in getting him safely to the fort. Captain Egan, on recovering, laughingly said, I name you Calamity Jane, the heroine of the plains. I have borne that name up to the present time. Again, give or take. Other origin of her nickname is when she warned men that if they offended her, it was to court calamity. Another account of how she got the nickname appears in her autobiographical pamphlet, where she claims that while serving under General Crook, her unit was ordered to Bighorn River in 1875. And it was there that she swam the Platte River a massive major river that spans basically all of Nebraska, for 90 miles at top speed. We're talking Michael Phelps level top speed. Got wet and cold delivering important messages. Then she got sick because she got wet and cold and had to spend a few weeks recovering, give or take. Then she rode to Fort Laramie in Wyoming, joined a wagon train, and headed north in July of 1876. We have no idea if the first half of that story is accurate at all, but we do know that by July 1876, she was definitely at Fort Laramie and did join a wagon train that included a man called James Butler Hickok. We know this and can confirm it was around this time that Jane started going by Calamity Jane for a fact, because on July 15th, 1876, the Black Hills Pioneer, a newspaper in Deadwood, South Dakota, announced on its front page, "Calamity Jane has arrived." You decide if any of the other stories make sense of how she got the nickname. Before I continue, let me introduce you to this guy, James Butler Hickok, better known as Wild Bill Hickok. And I need to introduce you to him because he plays a pretty dang big role in Jane's story. Long as heck story short. Wild Bill Hickok, which is one of his many nicknames, was a national hero of the American Old West. He worked as a cattle rustler, gambler, gunslinger, Union Army soldier, a sheriff, a marshal, showman, and actor. He is mainly known for his incredible gunfights and the many tall tales he fabricated about himself. For example, he claimed to have killed over 100 men in his lifetime, though the real number was probably totally closer to like 10, give or take. His most famous shootout was without a doubt, with Davis Tutt on July 1st, 1865, after a heated gambling debt dispute. The argument escalated, they took it outside, and when both men drew their pistols, Hickok shot Tutt in his left side, killing him instantly. After a 3-day trial, Wild Bill was acquitted of manslaughter, and just like that, Wild Bill Hickok became a Wild West legend. This gunfight is considered the first one-on-one quick-draw gunfight of the Old West, and this helped solidify Hickok as a skilled gunfighter. Where he enters Jane's story is around 1873. Gotta go back a little bit more here. Wild Bill, as he was known by then, was approached by Buffalo Bill Cody himself and Texas Jack Omohundro, who invited him to join their troop after their early success with Scouts of the Plains. Now, Hickok hated acting and didn't like the spotlight, so after a few months, he was let go from the show. He claimed he left because of vision problems, give or take, and Buffalo Bill went on to create the most famous Wild West show in the history of ever, Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show. It's believed that Wild Bill actually did suffer from eye problems, either having glaucoma or trachoma, two very different eye conditions, but both can lead to vision impairment and blindness if left untreated. He bopped around for a bit, and by 1876, he joined Charlie Utter's wagon train heading to South Dakota, hoping to gain fortune in the gold fields. It was there, in this wagon train, that Hickok and Jane first met. Since the two of them loved making up crazy stories about themselves and loved to drink, they hit it off immediately. By the time they arrived in Deadwood, South Dakota in the spring of 1876, one, the two of them were besties, and two, Jane became known for her shooting skills, drinking habits, and brash manners. Jane stayed in Deadwood for the summer, working as a Pony Express rider, carrying mail 50 miles between Deadwood and Custer, South Dakota, one of the toughest trails in the Pony Express and the Black Hills country. Quote, and there is a word in here that might trigger some because words known now as back then were two very different. You'll be okay. It was considered the most dangerous route in the hills, but as my reputation as a rider and quick shot was well known, I was molested very little, for the toll of gatherers looked on me as being a good fellow, and they knew that I never missed my mark. If you're unfamiliar with the Pony Express, and I'm so happy I get to talk about it, it was the earliest form of mail delivery in the American West. Since the telegraph and trains hadn't yet reached all the way to the West, horses were the best form of transportation and for delivering the mail. The Pony Express operated from April 1860 to October 1861, connecting mail lines from St. Joseph, Missouri, 1,800 miles to Sacramento, California. The horses and riders traveled at full speed, resting and changing horses every 10 to 15 miles at approximately 190 stations along the route. There were many famous names in the Pony Express, but most notably, Buffalo Bill Cody was a rider when he was about 14, and Robert Pony Bob Haslam, who made the longest trip, a 360-mile round trip in 40 hours, and the fastest ride in the history of the Pony Express. He traveled 120 miles in 8 hours and 20 minutes, wounded. Just thought I'd add that in there, to deliver the newly elected President Abraham Lincoln's inaugural speech. The Pony Express has become an iconic symbol of the American West, showing the resourcefulness of the people during that time, how mail and other goods were delivered, and how America connected the East to the West before the telegraph. When the transcontinental telegraph line was completed on October 26, 1861, the Pony Express gradually faded into legend. I cannot tell you how happy I am. I just talked about that. Now, this might come as a shock to some of you that know Calamity Jane's many stories, as it came as a very big shock to my mother. There is zero conclusive evidence that Calamity Jane was ever a Pony Express rider. It was more than likely one of her many tall tales. I cannot tell you the amount of shock that my mother had when she found that out. However, Wild Bill did work for the Pony Express as a stock tender/handler, basically the people who tended the horses at the change stations. Interestingly, this was actually the deadliest job of the Pony Express in the 18 months of its existence. 16 stock handlers were killed compared to only 6 riders. Now, in my mind, and a couple of articles think so too, Jane probably fabricated her Pony Express connection story to stay close to Wild Bill, as she totally had a little crush on him. She even claimed they had married in 1870, but she had allowed him to divorce her so he could be free to marry his one true love, Agnes Lake. But once again, there's zero evidence supporting this marriage claim. There's not even a certificate. Plus, some rumors even suggest, I kid you not, that Bill said he, quote, would not so lower himself to have any kind of romantic relations with Jane. And in my mind, that tells me all I need to know. I think Wild Bill saw Jane as, you know how some guys just have that crazy girlfriend or friend that's a girl in their life that maybe they dated, maybe they didn't, maybe they were friends, maybe they weren't. Maybe he just smiled at her one time and she just becomes obsessed with him. And then they become a little bit on the stalkery side. I think that was what Jane was to Wild Bill. That just inserted herself into as much of his life as she possibly could for no reason whatsoever, just because she liked him a lot. Also, again, and I'm not defending Jane here. Wild Bill's pretty dang cute, so hey girl, do you. When Wild Bill died on August 2nd, 1876, from a gunshot wound to the back of the head after a gambling dispute with Jack McCall, Jane wanted revenge. Reportedly, she found Jack at a butcher shop. Now, I don't know if she was stalking the man or if she ran into him there. Basically, though, she found him at a butcher shop and threatened him with a meat cleaver because she had left her gun at home. Because that can happen. She somehow captured the guy and brought him back to her cabin, but luckily, in my mind, he escaped before she could avenge her love. Give or take, another version of how Jane goes into this part of Bill's story is that she created a mob that threatened to lynch him, but it was reported that she was somewhere on an army base thing. I don't know. Again, give or take. Regardless, Jack McCall was later found guilty and hanged for the murder of Wild Bill Hickok on March 1st, 1877. After Wild Bill's death and Jack's execution, Jane continued to live in Deadwood, taking odd jobs to keep a roof over her head and to pay off her crazy bar tabs. She prospected at mining camps, and this is before Deadwood had its own version of a California gold rush. Supposedly, in the spring of 1877, she heroically helped save 6 passengers in a stagecoach while it was being pursued by Plains Indians. When the driver was killed, she jumped in, took over the reins, and drove with haste to Deadwood, give or take. When a smallpox outbreak plagued Deadwood in August 1876, Jane stepped up and nursed the ill back to health. I know, that's a bit out of left field. Shocked me too. Mind you, she had no formal medical training, but she had childhood immunity to smallpox, having survived it herself as a child, which made her invaluable to the nurses. Despite her reputation as a rough, tough, gunslinging cowgirl, Jane showed remarkable compassion and dedication to the sick. Physician keep on wanting to call him William Babadook. It's not. Physician William Babcock, otherwise known as not Doc Babadook, otherwise known as Doc Babcock, admitted there was the tiniest bit of an angel in the hard-broiled Calamity Jane. While tending to some children, Doc said of Jane, quote, "Oh, she'd swear to beat hell at them, but it was a tender kind of cussin'." That gives the biggest context as to who Calamity Jane was. When you look at her, you don't think of this woman that would go, "Oh, it's okay, you poor sick child. You're gonna be just fine. It's just a little flu." I see her more as a shut up and take your meds or I will beat your head in, little sick child. Yeah, she was tender to with the kids and she helped them beat smallpox. I mean, yeah, she cussed and threatened to beat them, but you know, it was a kind, tender kind of cussing. I love that we have that context of her. Jane left Deadwood in the fall of 1877, just as Deadwood started its own version of a California gold rush. She traveled with the 7th Cavalry to Bear Butte Creek. There, she helped build Fort Meade near Sturgis. She later left the unit in 1878, traveling to Rapid City, where she spent that year prospecting with little success. The following year, in 1879, she went to Fort Perry, driving mule trains between Perry and Sturgis. While this period might not seem like the most exciting chapter of Jane's life, Jane had already achieved significant fame. By the late 1870s, her colorful life caught the attention of Edward Healer, who wrote dime novels, a form of inexpensive, mass-produced paper-bound books featuring mostly fictional stories about crime, adventure, and the Wild West from the late 19th and early 20th century. Many of these stories claimed to be true stories, so it's no wonder that when Edward heard of the many tall tales of Calamity Jane, he made her a sidekick in several of his famous Deadwood Dick stories. Deadwood Dick was a fictional cowboy character Edward invented. The series became widely popular due to the association between the character's name and the actual town of Deadwood. And since Jane was in Deadwood during this period, her fame grew even more. Now, mind you, Edward had never actually met Jane, and most of the information he used in his stories was either secondhand or completely fabricated, which does not help dim down the stories about Jane's life were true or not, because again, so many of these stories are claimed to be true stories. But nevertheless, these dime novels gave Jane an entirely new spotlight in American pop culture. Backing up to 1881, 1882, she was able to purchase a ranch west of Miles City, Montana, along the Yellowstone River, where she operated an inn and raised stock and cattle. But this is Calamity Jane we're talking about here. She can't sit still. So this next wave, just follow, keep up. I'll put pictures where I can to help you follow it. Just just listen. Restless as ever, Jane left her ranch and headed to California in 1883. Left California in 1884, then traveled to Texas. While in El Paso, she met a Texan native named Clinton Burke, and they married in August 1885. Then on October 28th, 1887, Jane gave birth to a baby girl who, quoting Jane herself, was, quote, the very image of its father. At least that's what he said, but who had the temper of its mother. A little bit concerning that she's calling her daughter a girl it. There is debate as to how many children Jane had. We do know she had at least one daughter, but it is thought that she could have had 2 to 4 children. Again, we just don't know. And I'm squashing this right now because this annoyed me so much. Jane McCormick is not the daughter of Calamity Jane and Wild Bill. She shows items, diaries, and letters as supposed evidence. It's not. She's full of it. A total fraud. I had to put this in here because she is a part of the freaking story, but I'm telling you right now, she's full of it. It's a total fraud. Point is, Jane, whatever, McCormick is not Jane's daughter. That is it. That is done. That is squashed. We're moving on. They remained in Texas for a couple of years, but again, Jane can't sit still. The family left Texas for Boulder, Colorado, where they ran a hotel until 1893. Over the next 3 years, the family traveled through Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Washington State, and Oregon before Jane took her family to Deadwood, South Dakota on October 9th, 1895. Jane just loves her Deadwood, South Dakota. All the while, Jane tried relentlessly to sell her life story to anyone and everyone who would listen. By 1896, Jane wrote, give or take since she claimed to be illiterate, and published her autobiography, Life and Adventures of Calamity Jane, by herself. It's really brief, like 3 or 5 pages or something, but it is full with exaggerations, confusing claims, inconsistencies, and I've read it. It's a little bit dramatic, just a little bit, but again, this is the American Wild West, and this is Calamity Jane we're talking about here. Having the reputation of being able to ride a horse and shoot a gun better than a man, she thought, well, why not put that talent of mine to make money for my family? Why not? So, in 1895, she took her skills to Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, where she performed as a sharpshooter on top of her horse and as a storyteller. She toured with them to Minneapolis, Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas City. However, her time with the show was short-lived because she always managed to get drunk as a skunk and spend all her money on alcohol and was later fired for being a rowdy drunk. Give or take this entire part of her story, there's no conclusive evidence to support that she was ever with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And if you're wondering, because I did, no. Annie Oakley and Calamity Jane never met or knew of each other. They were both alive at the same time, they just never crossed paths. And I did timeline cross-check when Calamity Jane supposedly joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was when Annie Oakley was in a time of, is she gonna stay? Is she gonna go? She doesn't quite know. She's kind of taking a break. But they just never crossed paths and they never knew of each other, though I think that would have been sick. And if you want to know more about Annie Oakley, I'll leave a link to my video about her in the description and in a little card around above here somewhere, so that then you can go learn more about her. Her story's epic. She's epic. I love her. She's awesome. Go learn about her. In 1901, Jane was hired to do a job at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. What exactly she was hired to do? We don't know. The Pan American Exposition was a type of World's Fair, but it's not the same thing as the World's Fair, mainly because Pan American focuses on North, South, and Central America, and the World's Fair focuses on, well, the world. Anyway, Jane was hired to work at the Buffalo Fair, but just like the Wild West show, she used her money to get drunk as a skunk, and supposedly she got so freaking hammered that she shot out the bar glass and made a police officer do that famous little dancing jig thingy while shooting a gun at her feet. You know what I'm talking about. I'll put a video up of it. After that, she somehow wasn't arrested. She stumbled out and down the street, cursing up a storm at the whole town, and was eventually run out of the town. You have got to be absolutely unhinged at that time to be run out of New York. By the time Jane returned to Deadwood in the spring of 1903, she had nothing but a dingy suitcase and a raging alcohol problem. I don't know. I tried to find out. I have no idea what her family is doing at this time. Madame Dora Dufran, the madam of a local brothel, took Jane in, and she became the brothel's laundry and cook girl for the next few months. In late July 1903, while traveling by train to Terry, South Dakota, Jane had been drinking heavily and became sick. The freaking conductor of the train carried Jane off the train, and a bartender got her a room at the Callaway Hotel. Though a doctor was called in, though he did his best, Jane's condition quickly deteriorated. Martha Jane Calamity Jane Burke died on August 1st, 1903 from pneumonia and inflammation of the bowels at the age of 51. Supposedly, her final request was to be buried next to Wild Bill Hickok. So, 3 days later, she was buried at Mount Moore Cemetery in Deadwood, South Dakota, right next to Wild Bill Hickok. Her funeral was the largest Deadwood ever had for a woman, and her coffin was closed by a man who, as a boy, Jane had nursed back to health during the smallpox epidemic that devastated Deadwood. Another story of how Jane was buried next to Wild Bill was the men who planned her funeral were the same guys who later stated that Hickok had absolutely no use for Jane when alive, thought it would be the best joke ever to bury Jane next to Wild Bill so she could annoy him in death just as she did in life. Another account of why Jane was buried next to Wild Bill was as an early tourist attraction for Deadwood, South Dakota. And it's from that the story of Wild Bill and Calamity Jane being lovers has persisted ever since. Give or take, you got 3 versions, you pick which one makes the most sense. Was she buried next to Wild Bill because of a final request, a joke, or a tourist attraction? You freaking pick. Calamity Jane's legacy exists more as a fictional character than an actual person, since her story is so mysterious and there are so many unknowns. Yet, this hasn't stopped her from becoming a pop culture icon. She's appeared in video games, not surprising, especially a lot of Western cowboy type video games. Her life has been adapted into plays, songs, radio shows, comic books, and books, but television and movies have told her story the most. Characters and character traits have been named and inspired by her, including an episode in the freaking awesome old American Western TV show Bonanza called Calamity Over the Comstock, featuring Stephanie Powers as Jane. She was a villain named Calamity Jane in the original Batman series. In 1985, Jane Alexander earned an Emmy nomination for portraying Jane in the 1984 TV movie Calamity Jane. In 1997, her life became an animated series called The Legend of Calamity Jane, which aired on the WB. Her life has been in numerous TV shows, but movies truly cemented her cultural status. Most famously, the 1953 Technicolor Western comic musical Calamity Jane starring Doris Day, with the film song Secret Love winning Best Original Song at the 1954 Oscars and becoming Doris's 4th #1 hit single in the US. The movie touched on the romance between Jane and Bill, though Jane mainly falls with some cavalry lieutenant dude. The movie's a lot. It's a lot going on there. There was a recent movie made about her life released in 2014 named Calamity Jane, but we don't talk about that. There's a historical marker of Jane in her birthplace of Princeton, Missouri, and on the main street of Deadwood, South Dakota in October 2023, an absolutely legendary bronze statue of Jane slouched on a bench in buckskins, hoisting a bottle as if requesting a refill, was unveiled. And where it is in this little park thing, it's literally called Outlaw Square. Though separating fact from fiction is extremely hard, Calamity Jane has secured her place in Western history as an outlandish, brash, over-the-top figure. Yes, most of her fame comes from exaggerated and a half, made-up stories about herself, but remember, that was very typical for the American Wild West and the people who lived in it. The American Wild West was dramatic as heck. Those who actually met Jane described her as kind, generous, and sociable. But once you either ticked her off or she became drunk, she became as daring and courageous as a lion. She supported herself during an era when women had very few opportunities, and while it's unfortunate that alcohol ultimately got the better of her, in her brief life, she lived it freely and on her own terms amid the unforgivingness of the American Wild West. There you go. Okay, there you go. The story of Calamity Jane. I hope I did a good job at formulating and compartmentalizing, I think that's the word I need, of Jane's life. All right, look, I'm gonna get a little bit deep here, okay? I think Calamity Jane was a bit of a tortured soul. She wanted so desperately to be something that she made up so many stories about herself that we don't know who the real Calamity Jane, Martha Jane, is. If I may, I think that's the point of Calamity Jane's story. Be comfortable with the simple, boring self you are. Being honest about who you are is very interesting. I really think that is the main takeaway from Jane's story, especially in today's age where we have all of the social medias, all of the influencers. Be comfortable in your own skin. Your life might not be fantastical, but be comfortable with who you are. If you learned something today, and I sure hope you did, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And while you're down there, please leave a friendly comment. What's your favorite version of how Jane got her name, Calamity Jane, and how she was buried next to Wild Bill? I would love to know which one of you guys buy which version the most. I will see you in my next video, but until then, do not be well behaved. You just might make history. See you next time, gals and guys.
Come